Have you ever apologized for something that was not your fault? You apologize for sending a long message. You apologize for asking a question. You even apologize for speaking up, then immediately feel the urge to shrink back. Sometimes the word sorry slips out before you have time to think. People assume you lack confidence, that you are weak, or that you simply do not value yourself enough. But that is not the full story. For many people, apologizing too much is not about politeness. It is about safety. It is a quiet strategy your mind learned to avoid tension, rejection, or emotional risk. And today, we are breaking down the psychology behind why saying sorry can feel like the safest way to exist. The habit of apologizing too much is often misunderstood. Most people see it as a confidence problem. They assume that if you say sorry all the time, you must think you are smaller, less important, or somehow always in the wrong. On the surface, that explanation feels simple and convenient, but psychology rarely works that way. Human behavior is almost never random, and it is rarely as shallow as it appears. For many people, apologizing too much is not about believing they are wrong. It is about believing that their presence needs permission. Somewhere along the way, they learned that taking up space could create tension, discomfort, or conflict. And when the brain senses potential conflict, it does what it is designed to do. It looks for the fastest way to reduce emotional risk. Saying sorry becomes that shortcut. This is why people who apologize too much are often deeply considerate, emotionally aware, and highly sensitive to the moods of others. They notice shifts in tone. They feel the atmosphere change in a room. They sense when someone might be annoyed, even if nothing has been said out loud. Apologizing becomes a way to smooth the surface before anything sharp can emerge. But here's the part most people never talk about. When apologizing turns into a reflex, it quietly reshapes how a person sees themselves. Over time, it can teach the mind that existing, asking, or needing is something that requires justification. And today, we are diving into the psychology of people who apologize too much to understand where this behavior really comes from, what it is protecting, and why it makes perfect sense once you see the full picture. To understand why some people apologize too much, we have to go back to where this behavior was first learned. Not consciously, not deliberately, but quietly, through repetition, tone, and emotional atmosphere. Most people did not wake up one day and decide to say sorry for everything. They adapted to something. For many, that adaptation began early in life. In households where emotions were unpredictable, where conflict escalated quickly, or where children were expected to be easy, apologizing became a survival skill. It was not about admitting guilt. It was about keeping the peace. When a child learns that expressing needs leads to irritation, withdrawal, or punishment, the brain starts looking for ways to stay safe. Saying sorry becomes one of the fastest tools available. Sometimes the message was explicit. Do not be difficult. Do not make a fuss. Stop overreacting. Other times, it was subtle. A sigh, a change in tone, a look that signaled disappointment. Over time, the nervous system learned a pattern. Less presence meant less tension, less asking meant fewer consequences. And apologizing became a way to shrink preemptively before anyone else could do it for you. In these environments, children often became highly attuned to emotional cues. They learned to scan faces, voices, and body language for signs of discomfort. Not because they were anxious by nature, but because being perceptive was useful. It helped them anticipate problems before they happened. And when you are constantly monitoring the emotional state of others, you start to believe that their comfort is your responsibility. This belief does not disappear with age. It follows people into adulthood, into friendships, workplaces, and romantic relationships. The context changes, but the internal rule remains the same. If something feels slightly off, apologize. If someone pauses before responding, apologize. If you take up time, space, or attention, apologize. Another common origin lies in emotional invalidation. When a child's feelings are consistently dismissed, minimized, or corrected, they learn that having emotions is inconvenient. Statements like, "You are too sensitive," "It is not a big deal," or "Why are you upset over that?" teach the brain that internal experiences are wrong by default. Over time, the child stops trusting their own emotional reactions and starts assuming fault automatically. In that environment, apologizing becomes a way to preempt criticism. It is safer to say sorry than to risk being told you are wrong again. The apology acts as a shield. It signals compliance. It says, "I am aware I might be crossing a line, and I am already pulling back." There is also the role of conditional acceptance. Some people grew up feeling loved only when they were helpful, agreeable, or low maintenance. Praise came when they made life easier for others. Approval followed self-sacrifice. In those cases, apologizing is not about guilt. It is about maintaining connection. It is a way to reassure others and yourself that you are still acceptable. From a neurological perspective, this makes sense. The brain is not designed to seek truth. It is designed to seek safety. If apologizing reduced emotional tension in the past, the brain stored it as a reliable strategy. Over time, that strategy became automatic. The nervous system no longer waits to evaluate whether an apology is necessary. It reacts first, analyzes later. This is why many people who apologize too much do not even realize they are doing it. The word comes out before conscious thought. It feels less like a choice and more like a reflex. And like most reflexes, it formed for a reason. What is important to understand here is that this behavior is not a flaw. It is evidence of learning. The brain learned that staying small kept things calm, that being agreeable kept relationships intact, that apologizing reduced emotional risk. In the context it was formed, this strategy worked. But here is the critical shift. The environment changed, but the strategy did not. What once protected you can now limit you. And when a survival response outlives the situation it was built for, it often starts creating new problems. This is where the story moves from the past into the present. Because the same apology that once kept you safe can now quietly shape how you experience yourself in everyday life. It can influence how you speak, how you ask, and how much space you allow yourself to take. So the question becomes this: if apologizing was something your brain learned to keep you safe, what happens when that learning follows you into a world where safety no longer requires shrinking? Once apologizing becomes a learned safety strategy, it does not stay in the past. It moves with you into the present, quietly shaping how you interact with the world. At this point, the behavior is no longer about specific people or situations. It becomes automatic, reflexive, almost invisible to the person doing it. In daily life, this shows up in small moments that feel insignificant on the surface. You apologize before asking a question, even when the question is reasonable. You apologize for needing clarification, for taking a few seconds to think, for existing in shared space. Sometimes you even apologize twice in the same sentence, not because you believe you are wrong, but because something inside you feels uneasy about being noticed. Psychologically, this is not a habit rooted in logic. It is rooted in anticipation. Your mind is constantly running a quiet scan of the emotional environment, asking one question over and over again. Is this safe? And when safety feels uncertain, the apology steps in as a buffer. For many people who apologize too much, there is a deep fear of being perceived as difficult. They are not afraid of disagreement itself. They are afraid of what disagreement might lead to. Tension, distance, withdrawal. The apology becomes a way to soften the interaction before anything sharp can happen. It is an attempt to manage the other person's emotional response before it even forms. This is where the internal conflict begins. On one side, there is a very human need to speak, to ask, to clarify, to take up space. On the other side, there is an equally strong fear that doing so will cost something: approval, connection, belonging. The apology sits right in the middle of that conflict. It allows you to express yourself while simultaneously pulling yourself back. From the outside, this can look like a lack of confidence, but internally, it feels more like hyper-responsibility. People who apologize too much often feel responsible for the emotional experience of others. If someone seems annoyed, they assume it is their fault. If a conversation feels awkward, they assume they caused it. Their mind fills in the gap with self-blame before any evidence appears. There is also a strong physiological component to this behavior. Before the apology comes out, the body often reacts first. A tightening in the chest, a shallow breath, a subtle spike in anxiety. The nervous system senses potential threat, even if the situation is objectively neutral. The apology is not just a word, it is an attempt to regulate that internal discomfort. This is why telling someone to just stop apologizing rarely works. The behavior is not driven by conscious choice. It is driven by the nervous system. When the body feels unsafe, it reaches for the fastest familiar tool to restore balance. For many people, that tool happens to be the word sorry. Another layer of this pattern involves self-minimization. Over time, frequent apologizing teaches the mind a quiet lesson. It suggests that your needs are interruptions, your questions are inconveniences, your presence requires justification. Even when no one explicitly says these things, the repetition of apologizing reinforces the message internally. This can show up in the way people speak. They soften their language excessively. They hedge their opinions. They downplay their needs, not because they do not have opinions or needs, but because expressing them feels risky. Apologizing becomes a way to stay involved without fully stepping forward. There is also an emotional paradox at play. Many people who apologize too much are deeply empathetic. They are skilled at understanding others. They are thoughtful, considerate, and emotionally intelligent. But that same sensitivity, when turned inward, becomes self-erasing. They extend grace outward while denying it to themselves. In relationships, this dynamic can create imbalance. One person consistently takes responsibility for emotional harmony, while the other may not even realize it is happening. Over time, the apologizing person can feel unseen, unheard, or quietly resentful, not because others are intentionally harmful, but because the apology masked their true experience. It is important to note that this behavior is not limited to social anxiety. It appears in people who function well, who are competent, successful, and capable. Apologizing too much is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of adaptation. It is what happens when a sensitive nervous system learns that harmony is achieved through self-reduction. And the most difficult part of this pattern is how normal it feels. When apologizing has been part of your emotional language for years, it does not register as excessive. It feels polite. It feels considerate. It feels safe. Only when someone points it out, or when exhaustion sets in, does the cost become visible. The present moment, then, is defined by this tension, the desire to be authentic, balanced against the fear of disruption, the wish to speak freely, weighed against the impulse to apologize first. Understanding this inner conflict is essential because it explains why the behavior persists even when it no longer serves you. So the question is not why you apologize so much. The question is what your mind believes would happen if you did not. And that question leads us directly to the consequences of this pattern. Because while apologizing too much once helped you stay safe, it can also quietly shape how others see you and how you see yourself in ways that are not always kind. Here is where the pattern starts to leave quiet marks. Not dramatic ones, not obvious ones, but subtle shifts that accumulate over time. On the outside, people who apologize too much are often perceived in ways that do not match who they truly are. Their constant apologies can unintentionally signal uncertainty, even when they are capable and thoughtful. Others may begin to assume they need less consideration, less space, or less input, not because anyone intends harm, but because the apology quietly reframes the interaction. It places the apologizing person one step lower in the emotional hierarchy of the moment. In workplaces, this can mean ideas are taken less seriously. A suggestion wrapped in an apology sounds optional, even when it is valuable. Over time, this can lead to being overlooked, interrupted, or relied upon without being recognized. The person apologizing does not necessarily notice the shift right away. They simply feel a growing sense of invisibility. In friendships and relationships, the effect is more emotional. When one person consistently apologizes, they often take on the role of emotional stabilizer. They smooth over discomfort, absorb tension, and carry responsibility for harmony. The other person may grow accustomed to this dynamic, not realizing how much effort it requires. Slowly, the relationship becomes unbalanced. One person adapts, the other relaxes. Inside, the cost is heavier. Frequent apologizing reinforces a quiet internal belief that your needs are secondary. Every apology sends a small message inward. It says, I might be too much. I might be wrong. I should be careful. Over time, those messages shape identity. They influence how you think before you speak, how you decide whether to ask, how you measure your worth in shared space. Emotionally, this can lead to chronic self-doubt. Even when nothing is wrong, something feels off. There is a constant low-level tension, a feeling that you must monitor yourself closely. Many people describe it as emotional fatigue, not because life is overwhelming, but because they are always editing themselves in real time. There is also resentment that often goes unacknowledged. When you consistently apologize, you give without receiving. You accommodate without being accommodated. You adjust without being adjusted for. Over time, this can create a quiet anger that feels confusing because you cannot point to a clear cause. Nothing terrible happened. No one overtly hurt you. And yet, something feels unfair. That resentment often turns inward. People blame themselves for feeling drained. They think they are too sensitive, too needy, too emotional. In reality, they are exhausted from carrying emotional responsibility that was never meant to be theirs alone. Another consequence is disconnection from authentic expression. When apologizing becomes habitual, honesty gets filtered. Opinions are softened. Boundaries are blurred. The person may struggle to identify what they actually want because they are so focused on what will cause the least disruption. Over time, this creates a gap between inner experience and outward behavior. The body carries this too. Chronic self-suppression is stressful. It keeps the nervous system in a low-grade state of alert. Muscles stay tense. Breathing stays shallow. Rest becomes harder. The person may not label it as stress, but the body knows. And perhaps the most painful consequence is this. When you apologize too much, you slowly teach others how to treat you. Not through words, but through repetition. You show them that you will take responsibility even when you do not need to, that you will move first, that you will bend. Most people do not question that gift. They accept it. This does not mean people who apologize too much attract bad people. It means they attract normal people who respond to the dynamics presented to them. The pattern sustains itself quietly until the person begins to feel small in spaces where they should feel equal. Understanding these consequences is not meant to create shame. It is meant to create clarity. Because once you see the cost, you can understand why change becomes necessary. Not to become harder, not to become colder, but to become more balanced. And this brings us to the final shift. The point where apologizing stops being the default and presence becomes possible without fear. Not through force, but through awareness. Change does not begin by forcing yourself to stop apologizing. That approach usually backfires. When a behavior was built to protect you, removing it without understanding its purpose only creates more anxiety. The goal is not to silence the apology. It is to understand what it is trying to do for you. The first shift is awareness without judgment, noticing when the urge to apologize appears, not after the word has already left your mouth, but just before it does. That moment often comes with a familiar sensation, a tightening in the chest, a quick thought that says, "This might be too much." That sensation is not a command. It is information. It is your nervous system checking for safety. Instead of immediately apologizing, the work is to pause. Not dramatically, not defiantly, just long enough to ask a quiet internal question. What am I afraid will happen if I do not say sorry right now? Often, the answer is not logical. It is emotional. Fear of annoyance, fear of rejection, fear of being seen as difficult. Naming that fear reduces its power. Another important distinction is between politeness and self-erasure. Politeness is a social skill. It considers context and impact. Self-erasure, on the other hand, happens when you apologize for your existence, your needs, or your emotions. Learning the difference takes practice. One way to do this is to replace unnecessary apologies with neutral acknowledgments. Saying, "Thank you for waiting," instead of "Sorry I am late." Saying, "I appreciate your patience," instead of "Sorry for bothering you." These shifts maintain kindness without shrinking the self. It is also important to rebuild trust in your own internal signals. People who apologize too much often doubt their right to feel what they feel. They assume discomfort means wrongdoing, but discomfort is not evidence of guilt. It is often just the body adjusting to new behavior. Allowing that discomfort to exist without immediately fixing it is a form of emotional strength. Boundaries play a quiet role here. Not rigid boundaries, gentle ones. Boundaries that say, "I am allowed to ask. I am allowed to clarify. I am allowed to take up space." Each time you choose not to apologize when it is not needed, you are teaching your nervous system a new lesson. You are showing it that safety does not require shrinking. This process is gradual. Some apologies will still slip out. That does not mean failure. It means learning is still happening. The brain changes through repetition, not perfection. Every moment of awareness, every pause, every neutral replacement is a step toward balance. Perhaps the most important part of this shift is reframing what apologizing meant in the first place. The apology was never a flaw. It was a sign of sensitivity, of awareness, of care. Those qualities do not need to be erased. They need to be redirected inward as well as outward. You do not become colder by apologizing less. You become clearer. You allow your presence to exist without constant explanation, and over time, that clarity creates a new sense of safety, one that comes not from shrinking, but from trusting that you are allowed to be here as you are. When you look at the full picture, apologizing too much is no longer a mystery. It is not a character flaw. It is not weakness. It is a learned response shaped by experience, sensitivity, and a nervous system that once needed to stay alert to survive emotionally. At some point in your life, saying sorry kept things calm. It kept relationships intact. It reduced risk. And for that reason alone, it deserves understanding, not shame. But growth begins when you realize that the strategy that once protected you does not have to define you forever. You are no longer that child scanning the room for danger. You are no longer required to earn your right to exist through politeness or self-reduction. The world you live in now can handle your presence, your questions, and your needs far more than your nervous system believes. You are not wrong for being sensitive. You are not broken for caring deeply about impact. Those qualities are strengths. The work is learning to extend that same compassion inward, to allow yourself the same grace you so freely give to others, to recognize that taking up space does not automatically create harm. Apologizing less does not mean becoming careless. It means becoming aligned. It means letting your words match reality instead of fear. It means trusting that you do not have to soften yourself to be accepted. You are not too much. You never were. You simply learned to survive quietly. And now, you get to learn something new. So let me ask you this. Do you recognize yourself in this pattern? Have you ever caught yourself apologizing for things that did not require an apology at all? Share your experience in the comments. You are not alone in this, even if it has felt that way. And if you want more videos that break down the psychology behind behaviors most people never question, make sure to subscribe. The next one might explain something about you that no one ever put into words.